Good afternoon. Shall we start? Yes, I guess we can start. Can you all hear me? Yes, yes, we can hear you. Well, I guess we can start, right? Okay. So let me start by greeting all of you. It was so great to hear about your positions. My father was Ministry of Health. He was also chairman of PAHO and also VP of the WHO. So to some extent, I feel at home, even though I'm an engineer by training and also a business person. It is wonderful to have these distinguished speakers here with us. We are going to talk about the new economic order, the new world economic order. And to start, to kick off our session, I would like to tell you that we are ready to go into the new order. We are on the verge of a new global order. It has always started, in fact, and it started some decades ago. In 1970, UN held the first World Conference on the environment. Years later, in our Common Future report, coordinated by Goldbrüter, a minister in Sweden, and only 12 years later, the New York Stock Exchange market through Morgan Stanley Sustainability Index effectively started to codify companies and to what extent they really complied with the environmental rules. In the following year, the climate change panel was created. While corporate really resisted. They didn't want to acknowledge that the world had gone into a new stage, which is now called the Anthropocene.
Which means that the conditions of life in our planet depend much more on the predominance of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, and the way it's organized. It's now on changes in the natural order of things. And those changes, they actually have on their basis the change of the economic organization, a very or profoundly perverse organization that creates billions, we may say, of hunger and miserable people and a large income concentration. In some countries and within countries, and some people, families, and companies. This is reflected into a production system that is highly predatory of natural resources and that drives great pollution that impacts greatly livelihoods, health conditions, and today we see the very conditions of survival in the life of the planet because of the increase in temperature, high seas, lung diseases, and several consequences that the man seemed to ignore in his permanent search for a consumerism standard of life. WHO, Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, and I would say the health agencies in the whole world have been a voice pointing out to how noxious this is to our future. But only when those conditions were added to economic conditions and economic conditions deriving from the association of the combination of what we eat and what we use in terms of power with these negative effects. And only now the world is trying to wake up, and UN has established the goals of the millennium and now the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, this requires initiatives in 17 fields. It's a lot in many work fronts, but there is no doubt that the pandemic outbreak somehow came to reinforce this vision that, after all, our planet seems to be saturated by so much despite, so much ignorance, so much denial regarding what man produces. And since we have the pandemic, and there may be others, and everybody got moved, and the world can actually have the penny to drop, and people seem to be willing to work towards a way of world governance. The two other ways, the League of Nations after the First World War and the UN after the Second World War, they were stemmed from wars. And now the governance debate does not come from a war. It comes from an effect that is being as damaging, as so disproportionately inhuman as have the last century's wars been. In this setting, by understanding that the world has become our common house, as Pope Francis said at the encyclic in 2015, Laudato Si, that we have responsibility regarding this common cause. As a recent study of the London University has pointed, what would be the investment of greatest return to the world? It would be to send teams and vaccinate for free the whole of Africa, because this would hold the extension or dissemination of the pandemic. This would cost 45 billion pounds, but this would be an investment of high return, because the company once again would have their aircrafts full, their cruise ships packed, and the world is now gathering in Glasgow, trying to digest it all. And the difficulty of having a global governance is acute, so much so that US and China are announcing their own pact within global governance, sort of bypassing these large and past that created in the past this common dwelling. I am in the presence of great experts, and I'm just a businessman concerned about the future. So I'm going to move on with our meeting, and we're going to have the pleasure of listening, first of all, Professor Adalberto, who honors us with his presence. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon from Lisbon. Well, actually, it is the evening now. It is a pleasure to be with our friends from Brazil, and I'd like to actually congratulate our speaker for his excellent speech, and it helps a lot the reflection that we have. The topic was assigned, and paraphrasing Pope Francis in the encyclic of 2015 over politics. We have a will to understand worldwide the meaning of human life. And one of the positive aspects which globalization has brought to us is perhaps a greater possibility of our understanding the world in its multiple dimensions. We know that the critical factor of instability in the world and delay in its development, consistent lack of care, is a factor related to the persistence of inequalities, and inequalities between North and South, between rich countries and poor countries, and developing countries and poor countries. Whilst we do not stabilize on the planet an objective of development that is sustainable and at the same time allows the development, human development, to be aligned with this economic development and industrial one, we'll continue having the problems we had. COVID-19, as it's being quite well put, is only an episode in what is the normal process of epidemiological nature that mankind has known for many centuries. If we review the history of pandemics, we'll see that regularly and probably from now onwards in shorter periods of time, we will confront ourselves with situations like this. Of course, the natural phenomenon, biological and expected phenomenon of nature, infectious nature, but in the world is not free of phenomena like this, non-natural nature. And this is a question that is present in the dimension of security of the countries and strategic defense. The countries have to consider their protection of their populations. And COVID-19 had its peculiarity. The SARS-2, it came from the Asian continent, from China, from east to west, from north to south, and did not have any filter regarding the specific conditions of each country. In other words, from the standpoint of epidemiology, it was democratic because it has reached equally the most developed and richer countries with evolved health systems, and later, after some time, it impacted the less developed countries. What happens is that it was possible for humanity to understand that the simple fragment of RNA was able to put civil aviation on the ground, managed to block the economy, and managed to make millions of people to have normal life at work and had to be limited in their personal, professional lives at home. The lessons we have to learn from this process, on one hand, that globalization should not serve, as it's being referred quite well, that the world makes sort of misuse of natural resources. So we should have this vision of deepening and of try to avoid actually inequalities between countries and people, and the world will gain a lot from the standpoint of international cooperation. This is the role of international organizations from the UN, from WHO and the PAHO, and we have our colleague certainly has this experience, and it is very important in what has to be fulfilled in their skills and capabilities. We have to embed in the political discourse sharing, coordination, and understanding. Scientific investigation, development, technological development have to be something that the world gets used to share in a way that is co-creative and in a cooperative way. What has been happening with vaccines has been unveiling that still today what prevails a level of egocentrism, distribution of the benefits that scientific investigation brings. It's been mentioned to what happens to Africa, the estimated cost of 35 million pounds to distribute vaccines throughout the African continent certainly would have a return that would multiply by 10 or even 12. Well, countries like that allow me to mention the case of Brazil, that is a large continental-sized country, but it has a major role in the world. Countries like Russia, like naturally China and the US, the European unions, they have to be countries that promote understanding, sustainable development in the world, considering SDGs, but also in view of what we have today. We have 7.8 billion inhabitants in the world, and we're reaching the maximum level of sustainability if nothing is done. I would like to share and remind you, currently I don't have this information, that we have in Portugal, we have a very serious problem of demographics. We are one of the two countries that is more so beyond this threat.
Envelhecido, oldest, envelhecido.
So we have that related to COVID and other types of processes. We are a country with a lot of elderly people. And this is one of the oldest countries, or people with most elderly people in the continent. So this has been a debate, was the new order, a new economic order, and a new sanitary order. They are connected, interconnected, but for the first time we noticed that this thing is related to economy, and a public health crisis has actually blocked the functioning of world economy, and this view that is very much experienced in Europe. I've been to Brussels a few days ago, considering this new professional authority, the European authority, talking about emergencies in public health. It is clear today in the very European Union, and I believe the US and probably Brazil, understand that the investment in health cannot anymore be seen as a cost. It's investing in people and actually fostering better economy. We were caught by surprise. We had many people that suffered, many deaths, casualties, patients that faced hardships, but we had a reduction of wealth that till today is lasting, whose effects we were unable to anticipate. That what new economic order, new sanitary or health order we're going to have, it's hard to tell. I believe that the empowering and the role of the UN will be key, and the empowerment of organizations like the World Health Organization is key, and this can work as an increase of encouragement to understanding, and actually the understanding and sharing of richer nations towards poorer nations. And the pandemic, we may have to face a new pandemic, and this should be something that should be recovered and be more trained, not only in terms of health response and public health and care, but in the great drive towards scientific investigation and development. And I would stop here. Naturally, greatly honored and very happy to participate, discuss with our panelists. And thank you very much. I will hand over to the next speaker. I suggest it should be the director of the World Health Organization.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the invitation from FIS initiative to take part in this week of debates and reflections. And so, considering everything that was presented here by our colleagues from Portugal and other panelists, I'd like to share a little bit with you about the point of view of public health and new order and new governance. And now from the standpoint of health, first of all, there is a perception that no one was appropriately prepared for the pandemic. This is no criticism, of course. We are likely to plan the future based on our past experiences. And the past experiences that we had was the influenza epidemic in 2009 that was disseminated very fast, but didn't produce too many severe cases. Or its cousin SARS-CoV, MERS and SARS, that caused many severe damages, but disseminated more slowly, which facilitated control. No one was prepared, neither countries nor the global agencies that we have, such as the International Health Regulation, to respond to the pandemic with the severity that we had. The countries that has responded the best were the countries that were capable of adapting, of incorporating innovation quickly and reviewing their plans to incorporate what the scientific evidence had been demonstrating as effective measures, and in this manner be able to advance. There's still a lot to do. The epidemic is not over yet. Now we have a worsening in some European countries such as Germany and Holland, and the growth in countries like Russia and in other countries might be a demonstration that the pandemic will continue. On the other hand, I think it's very important for us to discuss global governance, and we need to do that. So as the multilateral forums, we need to discuss the mandates for verification and response to outbreaks. And I think this is all going to be on a panel on an extraordinary World Health Assembly that we are going to have very shortly for countries to review global governance and to strengthen it. There are some countries defending that we should change the current instruments. Other countries say we should have a new treaty, but the spirit of acknowledging that what we have is not enough to respond to a pandemic that is as severe as this, then it may happen again in the future. You don't know when, but we know that there will be new pandemics. The world needs undoubtedly to be better prepared. A second reflection is the deep interrelationship between health and economy. And so there was a severe impact of the pandemic on the economy and in society as a whole. And then we may have in Latin America a reduction of more than 10 years in advances that had been obtained in the fight against extreme poverty and poverty. We also had an impact showing the intrinsic relationship between economy and health. And so even the low effectiveness of response in Latin America, before vaccines, when we only had public health measures, they were not enough. When we look at the European countries, when they have a significant social protection network, when they adopted or implemented drastic measures of social isolations, and 2 weeks later, of the measures, the transmission rates dropped immediately. We didn't see that in Latin America. We had a very long plateau for many months in Latin American countries. and many of the countries operated. And I think they're all in countries with higher mortality rates. But in countries where half of the economy is informal, a significant part of the population lives in very busy and crowded homes and in favelas. So it's difficult to assure that the poorer and more um, families would survive to the contention measures, and they were not really effective. A third point that the pandemic made very clear is that we need to build within this new global governance of health uh, more resilient healthcare systems. The pandemic demonstrated the low resilience of healthcare systems, especially in Latin America, but even health systems in developed countries suffered and were not capable of responding to other public health problems in the most critical times of the pandemic. We are still uh, analyzing everything, but excess mortality that we see in all countries in the Americas is very significant. And now we lost contact. And so this is about 20 to 25% of excess deaths. But there's still excess deaths due to other causes. People with cancer that found it more difficult to have access to treatment, hypertensive patients whose disease got out of control during the epidemic because of the lack of access to treatment and medications, surgeries that were delayed and that should have been done. So when we look at the map of health services in Latin America that we had designed for continuity or suspension of operation, we see that they had problems, severe problems of interruption. Just as we see the degree of exposure of healthcare workers, the mortality rates among healthcare workers in Latin America were much higher than it was in developed countries because the healthcare system and professionals didn't have appropriate access to PPE, to well-established protocols for personal protection. And it demonstrates that we should have more resilient systems. There's an upside though. All these very drastic crises has forced us to advance very much on some themes that were kind of left aside. Consultation, remote counseling, the use of cell phones and platforms that were already accessible before but were not being used. If they are kept, they may be one important element to contribute for to knock down the barriers in access that are still present. Also, another important point is how the systems were not capable to operate to reverse the inequality, which is already huge in Latin America. So all countries with consistent data show excess mortality or higher risk of having severe forms of disease amongst Afro-descendants, poorer population, indigenous populations, and other more vulnerable groups. So they have more difficulty of access to services for all causes, and they also had it during the pandemic. So healthcare systems on the whole were not capable of defining strategies that were capable of reducing those barriers. Another important issue that we need to think about is undoubtedly the vulnerability of the concentration in the world of manufacturers of medications, vaccines, and health-related supplies. There was a disruption of logistic chains. In the Indian government, for example, suspended exports of vaccines and syringes, causing problems all over the world. Latin American countries had to fight to have access to masks and gloves in the beginning, and then respirators, PCR tests, and then vaccine. So all of this demonstrates that we need to think differently in terms of how to organize health governance and try to respond to vulnerabilities, strengthening the capacity for the production in Latin America in order to reduce this extreme dependence. And lastly, I think that equitable access mechanisms is important. I think that this image of sending people and vaccines to send people in Africa summarizes the correct idea that no one will be protected while everyone is not protected. So now we saw part of the explanation, the new waves in countries that had almost 75% of the population vaccinated. And part of it is due to the Delta variant has become predominant and producing significant outbreaks amongst non-vaccinated people. The equitative or the equitable access to vaccines is moral and ethical, but it's also related to public health. While there is uncontrolled transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, there will always be the possibility that a new variant may emerge that will not be protected by the current vaccines. So we need to make right decisions such as the COVAX mechanism, but without clear rules to assure equitable access to production, this mechanism, I make the image, it was an excellent car with a very good engine called equity, but without fuel, because manufacturers have always given priority to give vaccines to our bilateral agreements, and some of them charging 30, 40, 50% more than they had defined for the COVAX. So defining rules for equitable access is also essential for the new health order that we must and should build. And we are going to have the World Health Assembly. It will be another step for us to advance in that direction. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that the three of us are somehow agreeing and converging towards a major conclusion, because it's not due to sector-specific changes that the world will solve problems. The health change, the new health governance presupposes new economic governance, a new cooperation at the level of the global production chains, as it's been very well emphasized. And they failed to operate, to work, and they are driving countries once again to escape from a global vision that is complementary to a more isolationist, self-sufficient vision, each one on their own. And this will only worsen the deep lack of humanity in the current state of things. But I would now like to give the floor to Marcelo and the representative of PAHO, of the Pan American. No, I have just spoken. Now it's Marcelo. Okay, it's me, José Luiz. Thank you very much, José Luiz. Thank you very much to Minister Adalberto, Jarbas, and the dear friends from FIS Initiative. I'm speaking straight from the United States, Philadelphia, and a little bit of the history of us and our company as part of this context of the new economic and health order in the world.
I have been away from Brazil for almost 10 years, and about 2 years ago, because of the pandemic and everything that has been caused in all world systems, we haven't been able to get back to Brazil to visit our friends and our families. The first message is that the pandemic has changed our way of living and has still having a great impact in people's lives. Air Liquide, I have been in this group for 20 years. I was CEO some years ago, and many years I lived with my family in China, and now most recently in Philadelphia. Just for you to understand, the group Air Liquide Airgas is a world group for gas technologies and services, both for industry and also for medical hospital industry. I think it is very difficult for us to talk about a pandemic, post-pandemic situation without talking about an essential product that certainly drew the attention of you, my co-panelist, which is the crucial importance of oxygen that has been key in treating COVID patients. And this is one of our, if not the main products in the world, and obviously the main one in healthcare area and the hospital area. All of you have followed in Brazil. I from here quite closely. So many emergency situations that are being faced. Professor José Luiz, Dr. Barbosa, you talked about inequalities, what we've lived in the region of Manaus in the Amazon, despite the fact that the US is a first world country, very rich. Dr. Barbosa lives here. We've been through emergency situations, living critical situations regarding this fourth wave that has hit the US badly, especially in the southern region with a new variant, the Delta variant, creating several extremely challenging situations, I would say, from the standpoint of supply chain. One of the main inputs is key to life, which is oxygen. I use oxygen as an example to try to share the vision of the private initiative, our vision in terms of contribution to this new world economic and sanitary order. So it's a cryogenic product. In other words, it's produced usually in high pressures and very low temperatures, which means extreme difficulty to displace and transport this product. As any other product, it has a production transportation limited capability. I think it's being mentioned how frail the health systems are in poor countries, but I would include the rich countries. Many countries have suffered in the beginning of the pandemic. The US has suffered till now with the vaccination that has been proven a very complicated situation. We've seen what happened in Italy, news today, Germany with one of the highest rates of COVID dissemination since the beginning of the pandemic. And so the aspect of oxygen is fundamental. And the message or my takeaway message is importing, exporting this type of product is a great challenge. We are a global company with operations in over 80 countries, but we work in a very local fashion when we talk about supply chain. So this question by itself has created a great difficulty to all our industry in supplying this demand for oxygen that I believe could have been anticipated. I believe Mr. Jarbas Barbosa has talked about the difficulty in planning and anticipating what has been happening to COVID. This is a point I'm going to highlight, but we still find in regions in the US where the demand for oxygen has been multiplied by 3-4 times, especially now in the south of the country. Well, our lives have been changed. The companies have been suffering. The crisis is a world logistics crisis and of disruption of operations in various segments. And I'd like to leave 3 points for our discussion, perhaps reflection now and in the future within this new order that has been set up. And I believe it is intensifying. First, private companies require new management, risk management, and evaluation. We have to learn from everything that has happened in the past 2.5 years within the crisis, reevaluating our supply chains of production, distribution. We supply a basic product for public health, and it's been made evident that we need to revise these systems. Unfortunately, I say, medical gases are key and they cannot always meet demands in different points of the planet if they are not produced and distributed locally. So industrial risk management, logistics and business, this has changed and will keep on changing in private companies. The second point, which I think is quite important, and I believe it is to add to what Jarbas and Minister Adalberto have mentioned, there is a need, and we see this in cooperation with WHO and the handling of vaccines. It hasn't been perfect, but countries started having access. I think the coordination of sanitary authorities, of emergency management authorities like FEMA in the US, as the Ministry of Health did in Brazil. This dialogue has to continue. The pandemic should end, I hope shortly, but we may have an endemic situation of COVID that should change the level of incidence of respiratory diseases. This is very important because we need to plan and invest in the part of the companies to supply the health industry with key products. And I'd like to conclude with a question that was put forth and highlight technology and innovation, sustainability. And I believe the rich countries have demonstrated that the most advanced their ability in creating and in making and distributing vaccines without forgetting with great pride our own institutions, Fiocruz and Butantan Institute, in the effort of producing locally with foreign technology, but the private companies have a fundamental role in the continuity of investment in innovation, research, and again, giving a practical example to the audience with us, the example of oxygen generation in a decentralized way, locally in a more efficient way, consuming less energy and being able to meet the needs even of the most remote and poorer countries. This is a great challenge that we as a company have put to ourselves and will continue investing in research and development to socialize the distribution and access to these products that are so important. Sustainability, well, I'd like to say if there is, this crisis has impacted society in a profound way. There is a need to have a development model that our planet should be more sustainable. Again, private initiative has a key role in this regard. I remember even here in the US during the previous administration, not prioritizing this topic, large companies started prioritizing it. I believe this question, this topic has become much more evident during the pandemic. Public opinion has been a transformation agent, and I believe large companies like Liquide gas have a key role in having a development process of our activities that can be sustainable. Financial goals have to be hand in hand with goals of using natural resources in a recyclable and sustainable and clean way. And this is a key role that our company and our industry has in this energy transition that is so important for this new world order, be it economic and sanitary. So I'd like to leave this with you and I hand over back to you and perhaps open up for questions with the time that we have left for questions and debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Everything you said was very interesting, and you really complimented, because I think we all agree, even though we have placed emphasis on the public aspect and maybe institutional and governmental in the previous discussions. I think that you put very well the role of the private initiative that is very important at this time of transition, where the transition, the energy transition. The world has gone through other major energetic transition when they changed vegetable coal by mineral coal, and then one mineral coal for oil. And now we are starting this trajectory, which is not going to be so short. It might take about 20 something years in the pursuit of a production of energy that is friendly in terms of the environment. And then the use of electric power, hydrogen, and alternative ways of production. But all of this, and I have a few questions and not enough time, I think there's something that there is a certain recurrence, is that in following up and watching it from overseas, the situation of Portugal. So I would ask this question to Professor Alberto. And we see that Portugal has demonstrated great agility, it looked to us, in terms of doing what was necessary. And I thought there was a major support, at least it looked like that to us in Brazil, and from the public opinion, where the public opinion here was very much divided. There was a lot of politics involved. And so the perception that I have is that in Portugal, that there was a sort of an alignment between those proposing measures and orienting and those following them. Am I right? Is my perception accurate? Yes, it is. Yes, we need to be fair and we need to compare the size and complexity of countries. So we are talking about a small country with about 10 million inhabitants and comparing to a country with 100 million inhabitants. But it's true, Portugal at first, there was a factor that was determinant, which was the political agreement between the government and opposition. There was no dispute. So in terms of public health issues and whatever the scientific community proposed, they were well accepted by the population understood them, and there was no political fracture between the government and the opposition. As to the second phase, that the vaccination, Portugal is today the country in the world with the highest vaccination culture. We have 87% coverage. And this is a part of the Portuguese culture. The Portuguese like vaccines, and since 1964, the vaccination program in Portugal is very successful. So there is great compliance with vaccines. So with a logistic process that was quite demanding, in a very short period of time, we could vaccinate practically 87 or 88% of the population. Now we have started giving the third dose. What happens to vaccination, if you allow me? So we were well aware in Portugal, and I have been traveling all over Europe, Italy, Switzerland, and I have been talking to the colleagues in the WHO in Europe. We are aware that there is a wave coming from east to west, so that Holland is having very worrisome records, and we have the feeling, and also here in Portugal and Spain, are going to be hit by the same fifth wave. And what do we get from that? With the vaccinal culture, of course, the mortality is much lower. The main gain in this process is the reduction in mortality due to COVID and also the reduction of severe hospitalizations. So the message that we need to convey to everyone, and we've been following up with the situation in Brazil with great interest, that Brazil is a country with a very scientific community of great value, is that science is fighting an unfair fight, because people want certainty from science. People want science to provide black and white answers. And the vaccination process, in terms of a smaller coverage, and this has been going on in Spain too. In Spain, they have a very good vaccine coverage, but maybe we need to look at the country, cultural changes, and as our colleague in US used to say, we need to look when we see that in the US there is an issue which is very clearly social cultural. It's not related to wealth or poverty. It's related to something that happens in the US, which is very complicated in the United States. And I saw that in Russia very recently too. And I think that in Russia, the situation is even worse than it is in the US. But in any way, we are very proud about the resilience and the great capacity for adaptation of the Portuguese population to public health measures. Thank you very much. I would like to take the opportunity to thank your participation on behalf of the organizers. And I would like to ask two very short questions. The first is a question meant for Dr. Jarbas about this fifth wave. How is the WHO going to publicly take a stand on that? Because when it started, there was some criticism that you were a little bit slow in saying that there was a pandemic going on. And some maybe mistakenly and unfairly use that to justify the lack of action. Even in Brazil, some authorities said that I don't want to cause any embarrassments to you, but we are really on the brink of a fifth wave. I have a daughter and grandchildren living in Germany, where the situation is very, very severe. What does the WHO intend to have a more aggressive communication about the fifth wave, in terms of having a more aggressive communication to send out warnings about the severity of the fifth wave? It's coming from the east, as the professor said, yes. Well, but they are not rich countries. Dr. Jarbas, please. Thank you very much for the question. Let me try to be very objective. Number one, the pandemic is not a concept that is part of the international health regulation. The highest degree of alert in the current mandate of WHO is called public health emergency of international significance. When the WHO declared COVID-19, it wasn't even called an international public health emergency, there were very few cases, 400 cases, only 80 cases outside China, and no deaths outside China, about the statement. And then there was a whole debate whether it was a pandemic or not, because there is no objective criteria to declare it a pandemic. But I agree with you that the WHO defined 3 independent committees, 3 external assessment committees, and those committees had made many recommendations that needed to be adopted. But adopting the recommendations is not just up to the will of the WHO Secretariat. Because depends on countries, because whenever you give more power to multilateral organizations, you reduce a little bit for the common good, but you reduce a little bit the individual sovereignty of each country. So this needs to be taken into account. The epidemiological situation differs in different parts of the world. For example, here in South America, after we spent many months as the hub, we're having a reduction in terms of number of cases, maybe because of the high compliance to vaccination. In Latin America, if there's a vaccine, people will get vaccination, different from the US or Germany, also different from Italy, where in some regions they had denial, huge denial against public health, the pandemic and vaccine. And now these are the locations that are being most severely affected. Yes, we do have the instruments to control it, but it's not just up to public health. If vaccination increases and there are some groups that resist being vaccinated and they accept vaccination, it's proven that will reduce the number of cases, the number of deaths, and transmission capacity. And this is local decision. It cannot be a global decision because each place is one place, they're all different. But for example, in the Netherlands, there is a recommendation that may be having a lockdown again for 2 weeks, because when they have a lockdown that is very effective in 2 weeks, and this combined with vaccination, they can control the rise of cases.
We have the instruments. The problem is how to make those instruments to be effectively implemented. We see this paradoxical situation. 5 countries in the Americas have not reached 20% of vaccine coverage. They haven't been able to protect the most vulnerable. In the meantime, the rich countries have bought 3 or 4 times the number of their inhabitants. They bought a number of vaccines, and with the anti-vaccine groups and politicization of vaccines, they cannot control transmission. And this, no doubt, is a point we have to greatly reflect upon to avoid incurring in the same problems in the future, in the short term, to respond to this pandemic and to future pandemics. Thank you very much. It's been very clarifying. It's been an honor to have you, your presence, your explanations, and also your institutional defense of such important organization at this time of world governance. For us to wrap up, I would like to hear Dr. Marcelo Fioranelli on the autonomy of supply chains. This within a world leader, global company, highly respected as Air Liquide, if this has somehow corresponded to some kind of change in strategy regarding these autonomies, regional autonomies that we may call them, considering the difficulties demonstrated by the very failure of making supply chains to operate. I'm not referring to oxygen in the case, even masks, aprons, gloves, things that you would say, well, how can the US depend on gloves from China or even drugs from India? This Is this corresponded, in your view, to a change in the world organization of production in search of greater autonomy in these chains of production inputs? José Luis, thank you for the question. I'm going to try to be very objective. The answer is for sure. As I said, the whole process of re-evaluation of our perceptions internally, the way we assess probability, risk, and impact of certain events within a very long-term vision. Our company works with a long-term vision. I'm going to give you an example. In the US, we already have a series of decisions of investments, both increasing production in some regions in the US. I'm going to give you the example of Florida that has faced, perhaps it was the region that was most impacted by the Delta variant. And when we make the planning of our inventory transportation systems, the road system and rail system that is very efficient, it has always been very efficient, it's totally congested, and also using technology, trying to create new processes of generation and production, meeting the needs of liquid oxygen in terms of quality and reliability, analysis, etc., so that we can no longer go through these situations we've been through trying to meet this demand. So I conclude by saying to Luiz, the problems we face here in Europe, industry in general, it hasn't been a supply problem. It's been a demand problem that has grown steeply, absurdly, and we have to understand the new level of volume. This has changed the way hospitals and doctors and institutions address the patient treatment protocols in general, not only with COVID and respiratory diseases that will depend certainly on greater volumes of oxygen. This is being analyzed and implemented as we speak, José Luis. Thank you very much, Marcelo Fioranelli, for your participation, objective and clear, somehow reassuring and confident regarding the future. We have gone beyond our time, and we have that says that is quite important. Stop everything that the muse thinks, because there is a higher power arising. What is this higher power? Well, 10 minutes ago, there was a Flamengo match here, football match, and our audience is not escaping. They are sending messages to me via WhatsApp. Alquéres, schedule a continuity, something else. It's just fantastic. But now we have to honor our football team that actually is going through the greatest moment in its history, thanks to the coach it's had for 3 years, called Jesus. Yeah. So with my thanks to José Villar, the organizers of this event, I feel honored to be able to listen to you firsthand, clarify many questions, and understand the profound human meaning of these interventions that you, my dear panel members, have offered to me and our Brazilian audience. Thank you very much and have a good evening. Thank you all very much.